Hi, I'm Katrina Ingram, and I'm working on a master's in communications and technology, otherwise known as the MACT program. I actually just handed in my final project late last month, so I'm not officially a graduate yet, but I'm also not a student either. I'm kind of in academic limbo. And welcome to my presentation for DiHuCon 2020. We are doing this remotely and asynchronously, so I'm looking forward to connecting with you at the conference to have a discussion and answer questions. But for now, we're going to dive into this talk, which is all about data, in particular healthcare data, and how we might use healthcare data to deliver better care to Canadians. But before we go there, I just want to give you a bit of my backstory. So back in the fall of 2018, I was inspired by a leading AI researcher who gave a talk about AI and ethics and basically said that there was a lack of oversight in this area, that there was a lot of AI that was being launched on the world and it had very little ethical oversight and it was causing a lot of problems. And that led me to do some work in the form of a self-directed study on ethical codes. And what I saw as a logical next step in taking a look at those 30,000 foot ethical codes is figuring out how to make this stuff applicable at the development level of AI. So essentially, how do we apply ethics in the development of AI? That was kind of the question that I was left with. And that became the focus of my work with respect to my capstone project. However, today's talk was actually slated to be delivered back in the spring, just as COVID was unfolding. And at that point in time, I didn't really have my whole project finished. So what I'm going to do today is a little bit of a mix. I'm going to share some aspects of the finished work, but I'm also going to spend a lot of time delving into data in particular, which is just one section or one aspect of the work that I've done. And I kind of think about this like making a documentary film when you're doing research. You're gathering all this footage, and at the end of the day, you only have an hour, so only so much makes it into your film, but there's still a lot of really, really good things that you've learned. This, to me, is what this presentation is. It's kind of the things that maybe didn't make it into the film, but I think are still super interesting. So that's going to be the focus of our talk today. So this is what we're going to cover. I'm going to talk a bit about AI and healthcare. I'll do a quick rundown of bioethics. We'll talk about AI and data. And then we'll talk about a bit about what is data and what is, in particular is healthcare data. And then we'll get into this idea of the data dilemmas, and there are a number of them, and we'll wrap up with some next steps. So one piece of advice that I was given when I was starting my project, my capstone project, is to pick a domain in which to situate my work. And so I chose healthcare. And I picked it because it really is this high stakes domain. So there are literally life and death choices being made. Healthcare deals with some of the more thorny privacy issues when it comes to healthcare data, because healthcare data itself is some of the most sensitive and personal data that is available. So lots of different issues at stake here in this realm. Conversely, lots of upside potential. So if we can apply AI in healthcare and do it in ways that are very beneficial, we can reduce costs, we can deliver more personalized care, we can drive earlier interventions to prevent disease. So there's a tremendous amount of upside potential if we can get this right. There's also a rich tradition of ethics in medicine already. So unlike some areas, I didn't feel I needed to come in and try and sell ethics to people who are working in this space. I felt that they already got that. So that was, a benefit for me in doing this work. And then in addition to all of that, there was a lot of interesting things going on at a local and national level with respect to healthcare. So here in Alberta, Alberta Health Services has been implementing a system called Connect Care. It's basically taking 1,300 siloed software systems and putting them onto one platform to build the electronic healthcare record. And while this is not exactly AI, it is setting the stage for AI by aggregating all of this data in a consistent way. So that work started last year. And at the U of A, of course, we have precision health as one of our signature areas. We also have AI as one of our signature areas, and there's lots of researchers doing work in this area. In Edmonton, we have the Health City initiative. So there's a lot of focus on healthcare at a local level. And then at a national level, CFAR was rolling out its pan-Canadian AI strategy, and it chose to focus on the healthcare vertical as its first area. So there were a lot of really good reasons to focus on healthcare. And then, of course, COVID-19 hits, and it just became a lot more urgent to focus on these issues. So when the pandemic hit, almost overnight, we saw apps being launched across the globe, contact tracing apps, the use of mass surveillance in the name of public health, and often controversial methods that were being used to track people in order to help stop the spread of COVID. Here in Alberta, we saw a couple of things happening. First of all, virtual care, which was already a thing, but not quite as prevalent, became a lot more prominent once COVID-19 hit, and the government allowed a partnership with Babylon Health and TELUS Health to proceed without some of the usual privacy reviews and oversights. That is since being investigated by the Privacy Commissioner. In addition to that, Alberta was also the first province to launch a contact tracing app called Alberta Trace Together, and it was modeled on some technology used in Singapore. We've since somewhat abandoned that in favor of the COVID Alert app, which is a national Canadian contact tracing app. But all of this is happening very rapidly, and so it just sort of increases the need to really unpack some of these issues when it comes to the use of AI and other technologies in healthcare, and also how our data is being used and collected. I want to shift gears a bit and just talk a bit about ethics. So these are ethical principles in healthcare. And as I was saying earlier, medicine has a rich tradition of ethics. And when I was doing work on ethical codes, I found that so many ethical codes came out of really bad incidents that happened in medical research. So things like the Nuremberg trials, the Tuskegee experiments, things that caused really harmful consequences for people, kind of drove the need to develop these ethical codes of things that we will do or won't do. And in essence, there are kind of four foundational principles to these codes. So the idea of beneficence is doing good, non-maleficence, don't do any harm. Justice is this idea of fairness and equity, kind of this level playing field of how we treat people. And then autonomy, so the idea that people should have a say in their care, that they should have a voice. When it comes to AI, we add one more principle, and that is explainability. So explainability is important because if we don't understand how AI came to a decision, it starts to have potential impacts on the other ethical principles. So for example, how can you have autonomy over a decision related to your care when you don't really know, or your doctor doesn't really know how an AI decision support system is making a certain recommendation? It just starts to conflict with some of these other principles. I also want to do a really quick one-slide overview of what is AI. And this is still a field that I think we're navigating the agreement on what exactly it is. I think everybody has overlapping definitions, but not necessarily always the same definition. This is a definition that I like from the OECD. So I wanted to show this slide as well because the field of AI sometimes gets equated to other terms like machine learning or deep learning. And I wanted to show you this slide because AI is a lot more expansive than machine learning. However, what we're seeing is that a lot of the focus is on machine learning, a lot of the media attention, a lot of the funding, and even within machine learning, a lot of the focus is on deep learning or deep neural networks. Sometimes you'll see that abbreviated as DNN. And so in some cases, these terms get used interchangeably, and that's not quite accurate. And I just wanted to point that out. The other thing that's really important to note here is that these particular techniques of deep neural networks and machine learning are actually driving a lot of the need to collect data. So they're extremely data intensive techniques. and they're very, very accurate from a statistical probability standpoint. So they're kind of viewed as being cutting edge, and they're the methods that everybody is paying attention to. At the same time, because they're so data intensive, it's driving that need to collect a lot of data for training examples. So that's how these two things start to intersect. So I wanted to show you that. Now, in terms of my own project, I also wanted to point out that when it comes to ethics and ethical issues in the development of AI, it's not just about data. I also looked at mathematical models and I looked at people, but for the purposes of today, we're just going to focus on data. I just wanted to touch on this point because sometimes people are thinking it's only, the data is the only place where there are ethical issues, and that's not necessarily the case. This is a typical AI workflow. There are different examples of AI workflows, but I like this one. It's quite simple and clear and easy to understand. I've drawn a red box around the front end of the workflow, which is where the data is kind of input into the process. Now, obviously, the impacts stem throughout the process as the data itself is modeled and then interpreted. But to keep things simple, I just wanted to hone in on the front part of this process as we talk about data. So we're going to get into thinking a bit more about data. What exactly is data? And it's something that I hadn't quite honestly thought a lot about until I did this project. I think we all have a general sense of what we believe to be data, but how does data come to be? And there was a text that was written by Rob Kitchen, which was quite foundational for me in terms of understanding how data is collected and what data is. And Kitchen says that, essentially data is abstracted elements, representations, categorizations, a measurement of phenomena. And he talks about this idea of a data assemblage, that all of this is kind of happening in this bigger socio-political kind of context. And I think we can really see that with respect to COVID data. We can see that in terms of what is collected, what isn't collected. I mean, there were some countries for a while who basically were saying, we don't have any COVID because they weren't really collecting any data, and they chose not to for political reasons. So it kind of gets at this idea that counting is political. Data also exists in silos in a lot of cases. In many cases, it's incomplete. Certain things have been collected, other things have not been collected. And that, of course, can lead to bias. We see that in representations of data sets that we do or don't have. And really, when it comes to artificial intelligence, and I would also say probably when it comes to digital humanities as well, there's sort of this idea of the secondary uses of data. And in some cases, that's driven by this availability bias. So for example, we can get our hands on Twitter data, so we're going to use that for our study. So is it the best data that should be used in examining whatever phenomenon we want to examine? Maybe, maybe not, but it's available, so we're going to use it. So there's that kind of dynamic happening, but also with secondary uses of data, because we don't necessarily collect the data for a specific purpose, we're kind of reusing it to ask new questions. We can get into issues around whether the people who consented to have that data collected in the first place would agree to the secondary use. So it's kind of getting entangled with this idea of consent. And we can say, sure, they signed off on those terms of references that nobody reads on the internet, and they're okay with it. It's public data and so forth. But is that really, the case? I think we have inadequate protections in place. We don't necessarily treat consent. We treat it more like a compliance or a checkbox rather than true consent. So there's these issues that are coming into play, and of course that's intertwined with issues of privacy as well. Kind of pulling back on all of that is this bigger idea of surveillance capitalism. And Shoshana Zuboff wrote an excellent book about this. And this is kind of the business model that's underwriting a lot of data collection. And it's enabled by cheap storage, cloud-based storage, all these incentives to kind of hoover up all of this data and store it for some purpose, mash it up with other data sets. And at the end of the day, what these businesses are trying to do is better understand us so that they can sell us things or guide our behavior in some way. And that's really the business model of many of these large organizations like Google and like Facebook. When it comes to labeling data sets, which is something that needs to be done in order to train AI, so they call it supervised learning, and basically they take a lot of data and label it, and then that gets fed into the model, and that becomes the context for the AI to make decisions. In many cases, this labeling work is being done by people in the gig economy who aren't paid very well. It's being outsourced to other countries. And so there's this whole ethical question of how that work gets done. There's also an ethical question around the judgment calls that are made to label data. And so when you're labeling pictures, for example, even something like gender of a picture, somebody's making a judgment call about that particular picture. And that's, again, another place where bias can be encoded into the data. And as I was saying earlier, because of the methods that we're using around machine learning and deep neural nets, this is a very data-intensive process. We need millions of training examples to make this work well for AI. So in thinking about what is healthcare data isn't just the data that we generate interacting with the healthcare system, such as a visit with your doctor. And Sheila Jasanoff, who's a legal scholar at Harvard, talks about this idea of overlapping subjects and personas, which we are trying to protect. And the history of public policy traditionally has only dealt with the subject in the middle, sort of physical you. So your physical interaction, let's say, with the healthcare system. But increasingly, we have genetic or biometric you, and we also have social media, let's call it social media you, your persona online. And what we're seeing is that all of these different data sets that represent you can be useful in terms of providing care and delivering care. And so there's a sense that the healthcare system wants to use all of that data in order to deliver more personalized care. And this is problematic because we don't necessarily have protections in place for all of this data. And there's many different stakeholders at play. In some cases, those stakeholders are private businesses. So to give you one small example, Ancestry.com, which does genetic testing for the purpose of genealogical tracking, has your genetic data if you've used that service. Now, 3 weeks ago, they were bought by a venture capital firm called Blackstone Group for $4.7 billion. So you can be sure that Blackstone wants to seek an ROI on that investment. What does that mean for your genetic data now that Ancestry is under new management? It's a question, and this is kind of playing out in a number of different businesses. So that kind of brings me to this, bigger dilemma, and it's about balancing individual and collective interests. So we've all probably heard of the tragedy of the commons, and that's the idea that a shared resource that everybody uses, nobody cares for, can kind of get trashed. Well, I'd like to propose the idea of the tragedy of the AntiCommons, which is the lesser known cousin of the tragedy of the commons. And in an AntiCommons scenario, you have the single resource, but there's too many individual rights holders or claimants that prevent or limit the use of the resource for the common good. So historically, this looked like public rights of way for land use. So say you wanted to build a railway, but lots of different people own the land. How do you make that happen? Well, there's regulations in place that, allow the government to basically appropriate your land. But in terms of healthcare, there isn't necessarily that same dynamic going on. And I'm not necessarily advocating for that either. But I do think we can look at healthcare data in terms of a tragedy of the AntiCommons, because the value of the healthcare data isn't really about my data or your data. It's kind of this aggregated data set that's really valuable. However, there is a lot of protections in place around my data and your data, and there's a lot of restrictions in place about how we use this data, and that's kind of preventing us from truly enabling it to its fullest potential. So in Canada, those protections are governed provincially, and that makes national data sharing more challenging. In addition, as I was saying about private companies, there could be private stakeholders kind of enmeshed in this whole world as well. So one solution that we have to address some of this tragedy of the AntiCommons is the HDRN, which is the Health Data Research Network. They exist to coordinate the use of healthcare data across Canada, and they run a platform called SPORE Canadian Data Platform. And basically, they're helping researchers to navigate access to healthcare data, which again is held at and governed by the provincial regulatory bodies. So this is one way that we're attempting to address this AntiCommons issue. However, it doesn't necessarily get at the other side of this problem, which is, can I as an individual revoke or restrict my access to the use of my personal data when it comes to research? So basically, can I opt out of this system? And I went to the frequently asked questions page of the HDRN website because I was curious about this question. It basically said, please contact your local data center for more information. So I did go to the Alberta and BC websites and didn't get a really satisfactory answer. They just basically pointed me back at the Health Act and the regulations that were in place around how data is anonymized and how data is secured. So it didn't really get at this answer about, can I opt out of this system? And then as I thought about this more, as patients, we supply details about ourselves, but the data itself is collected, maintained, and stored by others. And in some cases, portions of this data are generated by the system. So if we take the example of a blood sample, we go in, we deliver our blood sample, but the lab tests the sample, they process the sample, they generate data from that process. So at the end of the day, who owns this data? Is it our data? Is it the lab? Is it jointly held within the system? Public resources have been applied to the generation of that data. So, if it's stripped of personal identifiers and this data might be useful in an aggregate form to further research, maybe finding a cure for cancer, wouldn't that be a good thing for everyone to participate in? But then if we think about, well, that cure for cancer, maybe it's patented by a private interest, maybe some big pharmaceutical company that we don't want to have the benefits accrue to. Does that change the dynamic in terms of what we would want our data to be used for? I don't have answers to these questions. I just think they're interesting questions to examine. And here's a few more questions that I think need to be examined as well. And some of this relates to the idea of incomplete data or siloed data. So for example, we don't have enough medical data for women. There's a discussion around whether we should collect race-based data here in Canada, which we currently don't do. Biometric data, which is everything from facial recognition to voice data to your genetic data, does that deserve special protections just because of the highly sensitive and personal nature of it? If we store our data in places other than Canada, it's no longer protected by our regulations. And then there's this whole idea of public benefit versus private interests. And I think this is an increasingly important question, particularly as we move forward with virtual care. And there are many players who want to play in that space and provide services to the healthcare system to enable that. This idea of scale is something that I came across as well, and it kind of goes back to that idea of AI needing scale, needing millions of examples, and the fact that our provincial healthcare systems might not be able to provide that. I've speculated about the fact that maybe we, are moving towards a national healthcare system, and what could that look like? And so I think that's an interesting question to consider. And then the idea of re-identification and privacy. So the fact that we take out all the PII or personal identifiers from the data, such as our name and address and anything that could identify us, it doesn't necessarily guarantee privacy. And there's a very famous case of an AI researcher named LaTanya Sweeney who basically re-identified the health record of the governor of Massachusetts and mailed it to him to prove that privacy is not guaranteed. So these are some other dilemmas or issues that deserve some consideration. So back to my high-level question for my own research, how can AI researchers implement ethical practices in the design of AI applications for healthcare? That was my big question. And again, I'm just going to focus briefly on the pieces that pertain to data. So this is where, this is again that model of the AI workflow, and these are some of the findings that I discovered through my qualitative research. I'm not going to go into all of these, we don't really have time, but just to touch on two small things. In the obtain step one, there's this disconnection from data origin, and this really comes from getting a secondary data set that just kind of lands on your desk, so to speak, and you as an AI researcher start to work with it. So that can really kind of disconnect you from the data, and also kind of create an abstraction that this data actually belongs to people, which it does in the case of healthcare data, that the data came from people at a certain point. So there was that going on. And then in the scrub stage, this idea of subjective labeling, setting ground truth, I think is really important. And this goes back to the decisions that are made in the labeling process. In some cases, people are just taking the data set as is and using the labels that were assigned and not creating new labels and not really understanding how those labels were created. So that kind of incorporates the bias from the previous data set. In other cases, people are not labeling the data super carefully, and so there's sloppiness that can come in there and create bias in the data set as well. And that labeled data is all that the AI has to work off of. That is its entire context for learning. So it's incredibly important that that step be done right, and often it's not done very carefully. One of the things that I looked at in my study to try and rectify this problem in a really practical way is a tool called Data Sheets for Datasets. It was developed by a team of researchers led by Timnit Gebru from Google, and it tracks the origins of the data and provides the backstory and context of the data. So it makes the process of where the data came from very transparent, and it was built off the idea of electronic component data sheets. So this is one practical tool to help improve the data governance process. In terms of next steps, I really think a bigger, more inclusive conversation needs to happen. We need much better coordination between stakeholders. And I think we can work on both ends of the problem. So we can kind of work on this from an ethics perspective, but we also need to work on regulation. I think both sides of these issues work together. In terms of me personally, I am working on an ethics toolkit for students. I believe that there is important work to be done there in terms of providing tools for students to help them build better AI and think about these ethical issues as they're developing their solutions. And I'm also in the process of building a consultancy to work with organizations in the healthcare space. That's the end of my presentation. I have a blog called ethicallyalignedai.com where I've been blogging about these issues for close to a year now. I'd love to connect with you either on email or Twitter. And of course, I welcome any questions that you have for me as we get together and meet at the conference. I also have a podcast, which is all about going back to school again as a midlife person. So check that out if you're interested. I look forward to meeting you at the conference. Thanks so much.